In the pages of American myth, the Wild West is often painted in sun-bleached tones: white hats, white heroes, white legends. The cowboy, as preserved in dime novels and Hollywood reels, wears the face of John Wayne or rides like the Lone Ranger, stoic, fearless, always righteous. But the truth, like the land itself, runs deeper than legend. And dust, after all, doesn't care about skin color. What if the truth stood taller than fiction? What if the man who embodied the spirit of justice on the lawless frontier wasn't dressed in silver and didn't ride into town with a studio soundtrack, but instead was born in chains, a black child named Bass Reeves? The time has come to strip the romance from the myth and let the truth ride at full gallop. Because for every imagined hero of the West, there were real ones. And one in every 4 cowboys was African American, forgotten by time, erased from photographs, left out of the songs. But they were there, riding, roping, fighting, bleeding, building the American frontier, not with the stroke of a pen, but with sweat, gunpowder, and grit. And of them all, one name rises above the rest like thunder rolling across the plains: Bass Reeves. Not just a cowboy, not just a lawman, but a force of nature, born in bondage, forged in war, and destined to become a legend, carved into the iron heart of the West. He entered the world in silence, somewhere on the edge of the wild. The year was 1838, the place Crawford County, Arkansas, a land where cotton ruled and men were bought and sold like cattle. And there, in the shadow of American contradiction, Bass Reeves was born into slavery. His first breath taken not as a citizen, not even as a human in the eyes of the law, but as property. His parents were enslaved. Their dreams, like so many others, lived behind their eyes and died in their silence. His father was a man whose back bent under sun and whip alike. His mother, a woman of quiet strength, whispered lullabies that carried more courage than any sermon. Their son would carry that fire, not in songs, but in steel. He belonged to William Reeves, a planter and politician who saw the boy not as a child, but as a number, a ledger entry, a piece of generational wealth. And so the boy was given a name that was never his, Reeves, taken from his master, worn like a brand. But the first name? That was no accident. Bass. It came from his grandfather, Bass Washington, a name passed down like a heartbeat. He began life in the fields, small hands learning to carry water before they could carry hope. He worked beside his parents, side by side beneath a punishing sun. He didn't yet know freedom, but he understood rhythm. The rhythm of toil, the rhythm of quiet defiance. In 1846, when Bass was just 8 years old, the Reeves family uprooted their plantation, packing their possessions, including their enslaved workers, and moving to Grayson County, Texas, a place that bled red clay and rebellion. The land was rougher there, the sky stretched wider, and young Bass grew taller, stronger, faster. He became known for his politeness, his strength, and a mischievous glint in his eye. Behind that glint, though, a storm was brewing, slow, steady, patient. George Reeves, William's son, soon took Bass as his personal attendant, his valet, bodyguard, and sometimes even his companion. It was an unholy irony, a slave tasked with protecting the life of the man who claimed to own him. But Bass learned. He watched. He listened. He studied the habits of free men and learned how they walked, how they spoke, how they carried themselves, not with pride, but with permission. Permission he had never been granted, but permission would no longer be needed, because the nation was careening toward chaos. The Civil War was coming, and with it the trembling of an empire built on stolen lives. The Civil War tore through America like fire through tall grass, unrelenting, merciless, and forever changing the shape of the land. It wasn't just a conflict of armies, it was a reckoning of ideals, of blood, of the very soul of the nation. And for Bass Reeves, still a young man and still enslaved, it marked the beginning of a transformation that would echo across generations. He did not choose to go to war. He was taken, like so many others, dragged into a conflict that wasn't his, by a man who claimed to own him. George Reeves, the son of his enslaver, had become a Confederate officer when Texas pledged its allegiance to the rebellion. George would ride off to fight for a cause that sought to preserve the chains that bound men like Bass, And he took Bass with him, not as a soldier, not even as a servant, but as something in between. A shadow on horseback. A man who didn't wear a uniform but carried the burdens of war all the same. And somewhere amid the smoke and steel of that chaos, something happened. Some say there was a card game, an argument turned violent, and Bass struck George, the man who had once held power over his every breath. Others claim the moment was more quiet, more deliberate, that Bass simply slipped away, vanishing into the tall grass under cover of night, carried by whispers of freedom and the rising winds of revolution. However it happened, the result was the same. Bass Reeves escaped, not just from slavery, not just from his so-called master, but from a world that had denied him identity, autonomy, and dignity. And where did he run? Into the wild, into the unknown, into Indian territory. It was no sanctuary in the traditional sense. The Indian territory, what we now call Oklahoma, was lawless, rough, and unforgiving. But it was free, and it was there among the Seminole, Creek, and Cherokee that Bass Reeves began the next phase of his metamorphosis. They did not see him as a fugitive. They saw a man with strength, with potential, with purpose. He lived among them, not for weeks or months, but for years, learning not just their customs, but their languages, their worldviews, their ways of surviving. He learned how to track across dry ground, how to read signs in broken branches and footprints invisible to the untrained eye. He learned to move silently, to hunt with patience, to live in harmony with the rhythms of the land. And he learned to shoot, not as a hunter, not as a soldier, but as a master. Revolvers became extensions of his hands. His draw became legend, swift, precise, deadly. He didn't shoot wildly. He didn't shoot for pride. He shot only when needed, and only once. By the time the war ended, Bass Reeves was no longer a runaway slave. He was a ghost in the trees, a rider of the shadows, a man shaped not by laws but by survival. Then came 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation, bold on paper, slow in practice, rippled through the South. Slavery, though not yet erased in every corner, had been struck at its root. Bass Reeves was now, officially, legally, a free man. But he didn't race toward cities. He didn't look back to the place of his bondage. Instead, he looked forward, toward land, toward legacy, toward a life he could build with his own 2 hands. He returned to Arkansas, to the area near Van Buren, and for the first time in his life he stood on land he owned, not worked for someone else. His land. He cleared the soil himself, built fences with worn palms, and planted seeds, not just of crops, but of future. And then he built a family. He married Nellie Jenny, a woman from Texas with fire in her heart and strength in her voice. Together they would raise not 1, not 2, but 11 children, boys and girls born not into servitude, but into possibility. On that farm, there were no overseers. There were no lashes, no chains, no ledgers. There was only the sound of laughter, the ring of hammers, the cry of newborns, and the wind rolling across the fields. But the man who had lived with warriors, who had crossed rivers and ridden under stars with a colt on his hip, he could not stay behind the plow forever. The legend was stirring. Stories began to circulate about a tall, quiet black man who could ride like a Comanche and shoot straighter than any white man who'd ever drawn steel. And when U.S. Marshals rode into Indian territory, they started to take notice. Oral history tells us that Reeves began guiding them, scouts, bounty trains, lawmen, who were chasing shadows through a land they didn't understand. But Bass did understand. Every trail, every creek bend, every campfire hideout, carved into the hills. He didn't wear a badge yet, but already he was becoming the law. He rode with them. He helped them track outlaws. He helped them survive. And slowly his name began to circulate through the whispered grapevines of the frontier, not just among lawmen, but among the very criminals they sought. Beware the black rider, some said. He speaks your tongue, he knows your trail, and he doesn't miss. This was no longer the boy from the cotton fields. This was Bass Reeves, a man who had escaped the noose of slavery, forged his spirit in the furnace of war, found his identity among warriors, and built a life with sweat and gunpowder. He didn't write this story in ink. He carved it into the land. He whispered it into the ears of his children. He thundered it into the hearts of every man he would one day pursue. The badge hadn't come yet, but justice had already found its horse, and Bass Reeves was in the saddle. By 1875, the American frontier was on fire, not with the flames of war, but with something just as dangerous: lawlessness. The Indian Territory, stretching vast and untamed, had become a refuge for the desperate, the hunted and the damned. Bandits, murderers, rustlers, and deserters vanished into the folds of its wild canyons, thick woods, and dust-choked trails. The law had no foothold, the government had no reach, and the people who lived there, native tribes, settlers, and freedmen, were left to fend for themselves. It was into this chaos that Judge Isaac C. Parker was appointed, a man known not for mercy, but for judgment delivered with thunder. When Parker took the bench in Fort Smith, Arkansas, he looked out across 75,000 square miles of disorder. It was the largest federal jurisdiction in the country, and it had no tolerance left for compromise. He needed men, not just enforcers, but hunters. He needed warriors of justice, men who could ride through hell and come back with chains full of outlaws, or the blood of the worst among them spilled in the dirt. So he turned to James F. Fagan, a respected U.S. Marshal, and gave him a task that would define an era: clean the territory, bring them in, men alive or dead. Fagan, knowing the scope of what lay before him, didn't just search for badge-wearing soldiers. He needed trackers, riders, survivors, men who could outsmart criminals on their own terrain. And the name he kept hearing, whispered by settlers and lawmen alike, was Bass Reeves. The black man from Van Buren, the one who spoke Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole, the one who had lived among them, tracked for the marshals, and never missed with a revolver. Fagan found Reeves, and in 1875, for the first time in American history, a black man was sworn in as a deputy U.S. Marshal west of the Mississippi River. Bass Reeves didn't just accept the badge, he became it. The weight of that star didn't rest lightly on his chest. The mission was no romantic ride into the sunset. It was relentless, it was dangerous, and it was deadly. Bass Reeves now rode with a stack of warrants, a pair of Colt revolvers, and the authority of the United States government. He was tasked with riding deep into hostile country, often alone or with a small group of native scouts, and cooks, traveling hundreds of miles into the very heart of outlaw territory. His average mission? A round trip of over 800 miles, through terrain that twisted like a serpent, in weather that punished both man and beast. But Reeves had no fear. He couldn't read or write, and in the eyes of many that was supposed to be a weakness. But Bass memorized every word of every warrant before he left Fort Smith. He knew the names, the crimes, the faces, the towns, and when the time came to serve a warrant, he never reached for the wrong one. Not once. He became a legend, not through bluster, but through discipline. He rode tall and silent, wearing boots polished to a mirror's shine, with a wide-brimmed hat, a long coat that flared with the wind, and a presence that made even hardened killers pause. He carried himself with dignity. He spoke with courtesy, but behind those calm eyes burned the fire of a man who had seen too much to be fooled by pleasantries. Bass didn't just chase criminals, he outsmarted them. The frontier was filled with killers who thought they were untouchable because they ran fast, or hid well, or surrounded themselves with gangs. But Bass Reeves had patience, and he had strategy. He used disguises, slipping into enemy camps not as a lawman, but as one of them. He dressed as a drifter, a preacher, a cowboy, a sharecropper, changing voices, changing gaits, changing everything but his aim. His most famous story, one of his finest hours as a master of deception: two outlaws, wanted for murder and robbery, hiding near the Red River in a shack they believed unreachable. Bass could have stormed in guns blazing, but he wasn't just a shooter. He was a strategist. He camped 28 miles out where no eyes could see. He changed his clothes, put on tattered rags, a hat riddled with bullet holes, and worn-out shoes that barely stayed on his feet. He walked, on foot, all the way to the house, leaning on a makeshift cane, limping like a man broken by the world. When he reached the house, the mother of the outlaws answered the door. He told her he'd been chased by lawmen, said they'd fired at him, pointing to the holes in his hat as proof. She believed him, let him in, fed him cornbread and beans. He waited. At dusk, the boys arrived, and Bass, ever the actor, spoke softly, said he'd be glad to join up with them, told stories of fake crimes, laughed at their jokes, pretended to fall asleep on the floor, but he never closed his eyes. When the two brothers finally passed out, Reeves pulled the cuffs from beneath his filthy clothes and shackled them both, without a sound. By sunrise, he was marching them back, 28 miles, with their mother following behind, cursing every step. The reward? $5,000, a fortune for the time. But more than the money, it was a reminder to every outlaw from Kansas to Texas, you can run, you can hide, but if Bass Reeves is on your trail, it's already too late. His record speaks like thunder. Over 3,000 arrests, more than a dozen kills, every one of them justified in self-defense. Dozens of hostage situations, ambushes survived, bounties claimed. He was never wounded, never bribed, never beaten. Criminals feared him. Judges trusted him. Citizens looked at him with awe and wonder. A black lawman who redefined power in a world that once shackled him. But behind the badge was still the man. He didn't chase glory. He didn't seek revenge. Every time he brought a killer to Fort Smith, he visited home, held his children close, kissed his wife's cheek, walked his land. And when it was time to ride again, he saddled up without complaint. He didn't ask the world for a second chance. He took it. One arrest at a time, 1 mile at a time, one sunrise, one sunset, for over 3 decades. Bass Reeves wasn't just enforcing the law, he was rewriting what justice looked like in the American West. Where once his hands had been bound, now they carried iron. Where once he'd been property, now he held authority. Where once he had no name, now his name rode on the wind like a warning. Bass Reeves is not a forgotten figure. He is the beating heart of the real West. By the late 1870s, Bass Reeves had become a storm wrapped in velvet. Polite in manner, calm in voice, and merciless in the line of duty. Criminals across Indian Territory whispered his name, not as rumor, but as certainty. When the dust rose on the horizon and a tall black lawman appeared, it wasn't just trouble. It was judgment riding on horseback. Bob Dozier was one such man who thought himself untouchable. Dozier wasn't a petty outlaw. He was versatility incarnate in crime. Cattle rustler, stagecoach robber, bank thief, murderer, and conman. Where others specialized, Bob Dozier diversified. His unpredictability was his armor. He moved like a shadow through territory after territory, adapting, evading, mocking the law that could never catch him. Except this time, the law came in the shape of Bass Reeves. Reeves hunted Dozier with the patience of a hunter stalking a ghost. For months, he followed cold trails, dead ends, whispers in saloons, and dust-covered footprints in forgotten canyons. He didn't just pursue, he learned Dozier, studied him, anticipated him. In December of 1878, the trail ended with thunder. They met in the Cherokee Nation, both men armed, both men hardened by the world. Dozier refused to surrender. No words, no pause, just a draw. But Bass was faster. In the exchange that followed, Dozier fell, dead before he hit the dirt. It wasn't a gunfight. It was a reckoning. Years later, in 1887, Reeves found himself on the other end of a legal crosshair. He was accused of killing his own posse's cook during a heated altercation. The details were muddled. Witnesses were unreliable. Some claimed it was an accident. Others whispered of tensions boiled over. But Bass Reeves did what few men of his time, and fewer black men, could hope to do in a federal courtroom. He stood trial before Judge Isaac C. Parker, the very same judge for whom he had delivered justice for over a decade. Reeves was defended by U.S. Attorney W.H.H. Clayton, a friend and colleague who knew the measure of the man. After careful deliberation, the court acquitted him. There was no malice, no premeditation. It was a tragedy, not a crime. The badge stayed on his chest, and the ride continued. In 1889, Reeves received a warrant for Tom Story, the leader of a notorious gang of horse thieves operating across Indian Territory. Story wasn't just stealing property. He was crippling livelihoods, wrecking families, and undermining every inch of law and order Bass Reeves had helped build. This time there would be no disguise, no infiltration, only justice delivered with speed. Base set up along a known route. When Story and his men appeared on the horizon, Reeves stepped from the brush with the authority of thunder. He called for surrender. Tom Story answered with steel, but Bass Reeves was faster, again. In a single, precise shot, Story dropped, his gun never fully raised. The gang scattered like dust in the wind, never to regroup again. Greenleaf came next, a Seminole outlaw who had left a trail of bodies across the territory. 7 dead, including lawmen and civilians. For 18 years, Greenleaf evaded every marshal, every tracker, every bounty hunter. He moved like a ghost, vanished into the forests and creeks, protected by tribal networks and the silence of fear. But ghosts can't hide from those who walk with shadows. Bass Reeves tracked him, quietly, relentlessly. He found Greenleaf, disarmed him, and brought him in onto live. A living legend catching a living nightmare. Then came Ned Christie, a name spoken in equal parts fear and admiration. A Cherokee statesman turned outlaw, accused of killing a U.S. Marshal and retreating into a self-made fortress in the hills. Armed, guarded, hunted. Reeves led a posse into Christie's stronghold, determined to bring him in. In the chaos that followed, Christie escaped. His cabin burned to the ground, but the law remained behind him like a shadow that refused to fade. Christie would fall years later, but Reeves had been part of the fire that chased him from the mountains. The badge was heavy, but Reeves carried it with pride. Yet even the strongest shoulders can't bear the weight of grief forever. In 1896, Nellie Jenny, his wife of over 30 years, died in Fort Smith. She had been his anchor, the mother of his children, the woman who had held the home while he rode into danger again and again. Her loss cut deep, deeper than any bullet. But Bass Reeves was not a man who retreated from pain. He kept riding forward. By 1897, he was transferred to Muskogee in Indian Territory to serve under the expanding federal courts. There, he remarried, taking Winnie Sumter as his wife. The home he built was quieter now. The children were grown. The world around him was changing, but duty hadn't. And then came the moment that would test not his aim, not his courage, but his soul. 1902. Reeves had just returned to Muskogee after delivering prisoners. He walked into the marshal's office, dust still clinging to his coat, expecting paperwork and rest. Instead, a warrant lay on the desk. His son, Benny Reeves, charged with murder, the killing of his own wife in a fit of jealous rage. No one would touch the warrant. Other marshals refused. How could they ask Bass Reeves, the symbol of unshakable law, to arrest his own blood? But Bass didn't hesitate. He took the warrant, saddled his horse, and went in search of his son. 2 weeks later, he returned, Benny in custody. He didn't speak much about it, didn't boast, didn't weep. Only said this: "The law is the law. I am sworn to uphold it." Benny was sentenced to life in Leavenworth Penitentiary, but time has a strange way of softening even the hardest stones. Years later, Benny would receive a pardon, thanks to an exemplary prison record and community petitions. He lived out his days in peace, the son of a man who loved justice more than comfort. By 1907, the Oklahoma frontier was no longer the lawless land it had once been. The state had been admitted to the Union. Federal power had taken root. Marshals gave way to state police and bureaucracies, and after 32 years of riding into hell, Bass Reeves hung up his star. But the badge never left his heart. He took a post as a patrolman in Muskogee, watching over a small district. Not glamorous, not grand, but honest work. During his 2 years on duty, not a single crime was reported on his beat. Not one. The mere presence of Bass Reeves, walking through those streets, upright, eyes clear, was enough. But time catches every man, even legends. In 1909, Bass Reeves was diagnosed with Bright's disease, a kidney condition with no cure at the time. His health faded like twilight in a canyon, and on January 12, 1910, the greatest lawman the American West had ever known drew his final breath. He was buried in Muskogee, Oklahoma at Agency Cemetery. No parades, no monuments, just the earth he had protected, holding the bones of a man who had stood taller than the myths around him. But Bass Reeves never truly died. You can still hear him in the silence between thunderclaps, still see him in the shape of a distant rider, silhouetted against the prairie sky. Still feel his legacy in the badge worn by those who believe law and justice should serve everyone, regardless of race, wealth, or name. He arrested over 3,000 outlaws, killed only when necessary, and never let darkness win. They say he was the real Lone Ranger. Maybe. But even if the legend was borrowed, the truth is bigger. He was more than a ranger, more than a marshal. He was justice, on horseback. In the quiet final chapter of a life that had echoed with gunfire, galloping hooves, and the crackle of justice, Bass Reeves faced an adversary no bullet could pierce and no handcuffs could restrain, time itself. By 1909, his health began to falter. A slow, cruel disease, nephritis, then known as Bright's disease, settled into his body like a silent outlaw. For a man who had outridden storms, outdrawn killers, and outlasted an entire era, this was the battle he could not win. And so on January 12, 1910, in the city of Muskogee, Oklahoma, the greatest lawman of the American West drew his final breath. He did not pass away in a blaze of glory, not on the trail with his pistols blazing, but in a bed surrounded by the quiet echoes of a world he had helped tame. There were no brass bands, no presidential medals, just the closing of eyes that had once stared down death without blinking. But even in death, his legacy could not be buried. In 32 years of service, Bass Reeves arrested over 3,000 outlaws, a number that would be staggering in any era, but especially so in a time and place where survival often depended on the draw of a gun. He killed at least 14 men, every one of them, by all accounts, in self-defense or in the act of enforcing the law. He never sought death. He simply met it when it arrived. What set Reeves apart wasn't just his skill with weapons or his tactical genius in disguise or his ability to navigate languages and cultures. It was something deeper, a moral compass so unshakable that it led him to arrest his own son, a decision that would have shattered a lesser man. His courage was not performative. It was not loud. It was steady, unwavering, and absolute. He did not chase glory. He chased justice. He died a free man, a black man who had once been born into chains and rose to become a symbol of law, order, and uncompromising duty. Though he was buried in Agency Cemetery with little fanfare, time would not forget him. His story, once buried beneath layers of myth and omission, began to rise again, like a rider galloping back over the horizon. In the decades after his death, a peculiar theory began to swirl in the corners of American cultural lore, that Bass Reeves was the true inspiration for the fictional character known as the Lone Ranger. The Lone Ranger, a masked rider of justice, dressed in silver and guided by a strict moral code, first galloped into radio dramas in the 1930s and quickly became a staple of American heroism. He was always accompanied by a Native American sidekick, rode a white horse and fired silver bullets, symbols of purity and justice. The parallels were intriguing. Reeves often rode with native scouts, rode a white horse, and operated under a strict code that valued life, fairness, and the law. He never fired unless absolutely necessary, never drank or smoked, and commanded respect across racial and social lines. The stories matched, too many times to be ignored. He had used disguises. He had worked undercover. He had built a reputation as a lone enforcer in lawless lands. Even the name Reeves echoes faintly in The Ranger. But as with many things born of oral tradition, the claim is tangled in debate. No official documentation links the creators of the Lone Ranger directly to Bass Reeves, and some argue that the character is a blend of several Western figures. Yet others point out the suspicious erasure of black heroes from mainstream historical narratives, suggesting that Reeves was too perfect a template to be merely coincidental. If not the blueprint, then certainly the spirit of the Lone Ranger lived first in the saddle of Bass Reeves. And whether the creators acknowledged it or not, modern historians and storytellers have begun to restore that legacy to the man who earned it in blood and dust. In recent years, Bass Reeves has stepped out of the shadows of forgotten history and into the spotlight of popular culture, where his legend has begun to receive the cinematic treatment it always deserved. The 2022 film Corsicana offered one such glimpse, imagining Reeves not just as a lawman, but as a man, complex, proud, and haunted. Then came Paramount Plus's 2023 series, Lawman, Bass Reeves, a dramatic retelling of his life and career that brought his tale to millions of screens. Audiences met not just a cowboy, but a black warrior of justice who defied every expectation, stereotype, and limitation. The momentum continued in 2024 with the release of In Search of Bass Reeves, a film that delved even deeper into his transformation from enslaved child to one of the greatest lawmen in American history. These portrayals, along with countless books, documentaries, and educational projects, are rewriting the story of the American West, not with fiction but with truth, and it's a truth more powerful than any myth, because Bass Reeves was not a myth. He was real. He was not a masked white vigilante imagined for radio drama. He was a black man who carried the law into places where the law did not dare go. He was a father, a husband, a tracker, a marksman, a linguist, a survivor. And most of all, he was proof that heroism knows no color, and that justice, when wielded with honor, can rise from the ashes of even the deepest oppression. In every prison cell he filled, in every outlaw he disarmed, in every child who whispered his name with awe, Bass Reeves carved his legacy into the very soil of the American West. His story has returned not because someone invented it, but because it refused to be forgotten. Today, in classrooms, on streaming platforms, in books, and on stages, his name rides again. Bass Reeves is no longer a footnote. He is a chapter. He is a symbol. He is a reckoning. In an age where the image of justice is questioned and redefined, his life offers a mirror to what it means to stand with integrity, to uphold law without bias, and to protect the innocent, not with words but with action. He is the spirit of the real West. Not the West of polished boots and empty legends, but the true frontier where survival demanded strength, intelligence, and an unshakable moral code. So when the dust settles, when the myths fall silent and the stories fade, one figure will still remain in the saddle, his hat low, his pistols clean, and his eyes fixed on the horizon. His name is Bass Reeves, and now the world knows it.